Democrats have added subpoenas to their arsenal in the battle to see more than sentence fragments from the nearly 400-page Mueller report. Today, the House Judiciary Committee voting to authorize a subpoena for the full unredacted Mueller report and all of the underlying evidence used to reach its conclusions. Or in the case of the obstruction investigation, the evidence that led to no conclusion being reached by the special counsel, an outcome that is only adding to the Democrats' ammunition in the battle overseeing more than Attorney General Barr's selective summary of the actual report. Chairman Jerry Nadler spoke about the standoff with the AG ahead of the strictly party line vote.
The Mueller report probably isn't the, quote, total exoneration, unquote, the president claims it to be. And in any event, the committee has a job to do. On multiple occasions, I have asked Attorney General Barr to work with us. He has so far refused. I will give him time to change his mind. But if we cannot reach an accommodation, then we will have no choice but to issue subpoenas for these materials. And if the department still refuses, then it should be up to a judge, not the president and not his political appointee, to decide whether or not it is appropriate for the committee to review the complete record.
The committee also authorizing subpoenas for 5 West Wing staffers who were likely witnesses in the obstruction investigation. The subpoena votes come on the same day that Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff, chairman of the House Intel Committee, suggested that Mueller himself is likely to face questions from Congress on his findings.
I think it's inevitable Bob Mueller is going to have to testify before Congress. I would think that he will probably be needed before more than one committee.
And speaking of Chairman Schiff, news breaking this afternoon that the House Intelligence Committee is seeking documents related to the investigation into the Trump Inaugural Committee, known to also be under investigation by the Southern District of New York. From that Times report, quote, the House Intelligence Committee has asked one of the top contractors to President Trump's inaugural to provide it with documents about the event. A person familiar with the situation said on Wednesday, opening up a new line of inquiry into the planning and financing of the ceremonies. The committee asked for documents from Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, who had been a close friend of the First Lady Melania Trump and who had helped plan the celebrations and parties around the inaugural, the person said. Our friend and colleague Emily Jane Fox adds to this in her report for Vanity Fair, quote, Wolkoff's pending cooperation with Congress and her involvement with the investigation out of the Southern District point to the ways in which she could be helpful to investigators going forward. The piece adds, while Wolkoff had an insider's view into Trump world as a point person for the inauguration and an advisor to Melania, she is also just one of dozens of individuals and entities who have received document requests from Democrats in recent weeks. Joining us to discuss the multiple fronts of federal and congressional investigations into the president, some of our favorite reporters and friends. From Birmingham, Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney on set, Associated Press White House reporter Jonathan Lemire, Frank Figluzzi at the table today. That's a treat. Former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI, Princeton University professor Eddie Glaude, and Jim Messina, former Obama campaign manager and deputy chief of staff in his White House. This probably only looks good compared to where you've spent the last few weeks. We'll talk about that later. Glad to hear. Let me ask you, though, about Chairman Nadler setting a very restrained tone, making very clear that even while authorizing subpoenas, which is a clear escalation in their effort to see more than sentence fragments, and it's remarkable to me. We're now going on weeks of a 22-month-long investigation, and all that's been released are sentence fragments from Mueller's 22-month investigation. But now they're still sort of exercising discipline and certainly sounding like someone who's willing to give Attorney General Barr the benefit of the doubt.
Well, Chairman Nadler was a member of Congress when Bill Clinton was investigated. He's seen how this went, and he saw the investigators lose the politics of it. So he's being very, very careful. He wants to make sure that every single dot is hit here. But I think long-term, President Trump's people are doing him no political service by dragging this out. Yeah. We're now going to talk about this for weeks and weeks and weeks. We're going to have hearings. We're going to get Mueller to testify. We're going to fight over this report, and they're just going to drag this on into the summer in a way that's really silly. They should get all this done and get it past them, but instead they seem to want to fight.
Well, what else could they be doing? I mean, you'd have to live in a cave with no Wi-Fi. I mean, they have to be aware of how bad this looks, and we don't know what they'd had and what decisions they made inside the small circle, the Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General. But they have to know by now how it looks. It looks at this point like a whitewash.
Every day that goes by, Nicole, that we don't see a release of a report from the Attorney General makes Barr look more and more like a political animal and less like America's attorney. And from the way that I know Mueller works, he would not have simply handed this report raw to Barr and walk away. He would have said, I've done the homework here. I've declassified in a way that you can take or leave, but we've gone through the declass process. I have recommendations on how to get around the grand jury issues. Here's my advice. I do not believe that Barr needs all of this time to do what he says he's doing, and he runs the risk of turning the public tide against him and a further demand coming out for all of this report.
You're always right, so I just want to press you on this. Do you know, I mean, is it just your knowledge of how this works, or do you know that something, an unclassified version of something was offered to the Attorney General when they were done?
I have no special knowledge of this. I just know from 25 years at the Bureau and then working as assistant director under Mueller that he's not the kind of guy to say, here it is, boss, knock yourself out. He would have gone through the process and at least given him a roadmap to declassification so it wouldn't have taken this long.
He also gave him a 3-week heads up that he wasn't going to reach a conclusion on obstruction. They had 3 weeks in which they knew there was no conclusion on obstruction to figure out how to release more than sentence fragments.
Which is why we're back to why Mueller testifying on the Hill is so critically important to get to the real facts, the dialogue that went on between the two of them, the AG and Mueller, and then all of the footnotes about why he didn't ask for an in-person Trump interview, why he didn't go to grand jury. All of that needs to be explained.
There is a growing nervousness among people close to the president about how this process has played out. We saw what happened initially.
I don't know whether to laugh or cry.
When the 4-page...
Really?
Yeah, well, that's a
Do you follow him on Twitter? They should be nervous.
Breaking news there, Nicole. You know, when the 4-page summary came out, there was an effort clearly to frame it, to take that and to frame the story and say that this is a win. You know, we saw the president and his allies those first couple days on Twitter. We saw the president's rally in Michigan where he opened up with this screed about the rally, about the report and its findings, and suggesting it was a witch hunt. He's been vindicated. And even then, according to our reporting, there were some people who were a little nervous about that, suggesting, well, we don't know everything that's in there. Like, there's a chance this could backfire. There'll be other shoes to drop, even if the overall conclusions are what the summary says they are. You know, that there could be stuff in there that, if at the very least, is going to be embarrassing for this president, and it looks bad for him and this White House. So there was a hesitation about whether he should take a full-fledged victory lap or not on this. And now we are seeing in recent days the anxiety building in his tweets. We're seeing it play out, suggesting that suggesting that maybe it all shouldn't come out. Like, at one moment at Mar-a-Lago, I was in the room with him last Friday where he said, yes, of course, if the Attorney General wants to put it up, that's fine. 24 hours later on Twitter, he suggested quite the opposite. So there is a growing concern in there that this is going to, when it does come out, it's going to look bad. And the longer it stretches, you know, the impact will be that much worse.
We're so desensitized to Donald Trump's instability around all questions about the investigation, but it's worth watching what you're describing. Let's look at that.
To the Attorney General, but it wouldn't bother me at all. Up to the Attorney General, wouldn't bother me at all.
Does the public have a right to see the Mueller report?
I don't mind. I mean, frankly, I told the House, if you want, let them see it.
Well, I have great confidence in the Attorney General, and if that's what he'd like to do, I have nothing to hide.
That's what you're talking about.
Yes, so that's a great room also at Mar-a-Lago.
Very shiny.
Very strange lighting. But yes, he's still publicly saying those things, but so that was Friday. And over the weekend, there's suddenly some of the tenor changed further, and a little more of a reluctance from him and people around him to see this whole thing. And now we're seeing a movement from House Republicans and so on to push that more and more of it should be redacted.
I want to turn to the inaugural committee investigation, but I want to ask you something, because you and I were around some of the same tables in 2016, and the idea that simply not being prosecuted but having your conduct detailed can't do devastating political harm is something he could pick up the phone and call Hillary Clinton and ask her about.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think what Chairman Nadler is doing is really important. He's not overstepping or getting over his skis. I think it's important for Congress to exercise its constitutional responsibility with regards to oversight, and it's particularly important in this moment as we try to get more than a few fragments. That we need transparency and oversight are necessary in a culture of lies and corruption. Because our democracy is at stake here. So I think we need to be very deliberate in the way that Nadler is being deliberate, the way that Cummings is being deliberate, right? So that we understand the political hay that can be made of it, but the stakes are high. And if Trump thinks he can escape this, right, we'll find out very quickly that he's mistaken.
Joyce, I'm promising to get to this other story, but I can't let this round go by without asking about all these topics. One, this idea that the president thought he was in the clear before any of the investigation was out, other than fragments of sentences, and the role that Barr appears to be playing. Again, we don't know what role he's actually playing. We don't know what his challenges are. We don't know exactly. I mean, Frank surmises that he was given something more ready to wear, if you will, than we're being led to believe by the amount of time that it's taking to get it out. Your thoughts on all those topics?
I think Frank has to be absolutely right here. You know, prosecutors are very invested in a case that they've been investigating for 2 years. They don't just toss it over and say, do whatever you want to do with this, Mr. Attorney General. They write it up. They write it up in a form that's usable. And here that means that they would have segregated classified information. They would have likely prepared a clean version without grand jury. I thought for a long time that they might even have gone to the judge to obtain an order that would have permitted the Attorney General to turn over what grand jury was included in the report. They apparently didn't do it. But Frank's absolutely right. And, you know, to Jim's point, you have to imagine that this report is very damaging if the president is willing to let this unfortunate scenario drag on for this long, knowing it will continue to damage him. We know he jumps to conclusions. We know he doesn't listen to briefings. It's possible that he heard Mueller isn't going to indict you, thought he had been given a clean, bill of health, and you can envision this notion that it subsequently dawned upon him that there was highly damaging material in this report, and he's been backpedaling ever since.
And let me stay with you, Joyce, on the other news breaking this afternoon in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Vanity Fair, that to borrow a term first coined, I think, by Chris Christie, there's another tour guide for the Southern District of New York. This is a former close confidant of Melania Trump. She's a witness in the Southern District of New York's investigation into the Trump Inaugural Committee. Now, a lot of the stories about that investigation center around pro-Russian Ukrainians who were swirling around the inauguration. Some of the other reporting out of the New York Times and other places has been about the mismanagement of money, about how fungible funds sort of flowed in and out carelessly. There's also some public reporting about Tom Barrack being of interest to investigators. What do you make of this two-pronged investigation and seemingly intensifying scrutiny of the inaugural committee and the witnesses there?
There are a lot of potential lines of inquiry here that federal prosecutors could have jurisdiction over. It's illegal to knowingly accept a contribution from a foreigner for an inauguration. That would be a pretty clean crime, assuming that they have evidence of knowledge and intent. But this fraud area is much more wide open. And if these contributions were being taken and were then misused, if there was wire fraud involved or some other sort of fraud, this could be a pretty lengthy investigation. And I think the most interesting thing here is, unlike so many instances when Trump surrounded himself with unsavory people, with people who were willing to accept criminality or at best unethical conduct, here, apparently, Melania Trump brought in a friend who wasn't impressed by misconduct, who had had enough, who kept records, and this may well prove to be an important roadmap, or as you say, a tour guide for prosecutors in SDNY.
And here's some information that Maggie Haberman of the New York Times has tweeted out, and that's in her reporting. Wolkoff has been cooperating with the Southern District since last fall under a gag order. It's unusual for such a gag order to be put in place. Mueller periodically used them with folks like Gates, but SDNY is not known to have done so in any of the Cohen-related cases other than Winston Wolkoff. Frank?
Wow, so a prophylactic gag order, it looks like, just to make sure that she's not giving up what's going on. This is not someone who's been outspoken about her cooperation, but rather someone they need to keep secret about
Is that to
cooperation.
protect her? Is that in the witness tampering protection category?
I think it's probably twofold. I think it's one, to protect her, and then secondly, to ensure that she's not tipping off certain people. She can't talk to individuals who are potential subjects of the case and let them know what's going on. It's a significant finding.
Let me ask you about the Senate Intel, or the House Intel Committee's interest in her. This is also from Maggie Haberman's reporting and her colleagues. It's unclear what was requested or why the Intelligence Committee is now involved, but it adds a new layer to the existing federal investigations into the inaugural committee, which was run by Thomas J. Barrack, a close friend of the president, with help from some former Trump political aides.
The worst job I ever had in American politics was chairman of the inaugural parade. I'm still not sure how I got that job. And what you learn about these things is, one, you don't have enough time to plan them. Two, there are different rules, to your point, about who can give, how much they can give, all these things. And three, you have a bunch of people trying to get around the various activities that shouldn't be there. And if the House Intelligence Committee is looking at it, it's because they believe there was outside influence from foreign actors. That's the only reason why they would be involved in this. It should be in a different committee. And so that, and the way they're using prophylactic gag orders, to your point, is unprecedented, and it means that they think they have something bigger than just spending dumb money on beer.
And again, the foreign actors in question are not from Venezuela, neither are they from Canada, they're not from North Korea, they're not from China. They are pro-Russian Ukrainians, as has been publicly reported.
It always seems to go back there, even after, how many days are we after the Mueller probe wrapping up, and the idea of there's no obvious criminal evidence of a conspiracy, but yet the questions still remain. It's Russia. It has been Russia throughout. The change in the platform at the RNC, the president's deferential behavior towards Putin, some of the way that he's tried to block Senate's attempts to sanction, the Congress attempts to sanction Russia. It's time and time again, and it's one of those things where even if there wasn't a actual conspiracy of collusion, if you will, but it raised questions. There are ties there. If not, there are business developments. We know about Trump Tower Moscow. What else is going on? And it just continues to, this is going to be a cloud that hovers this White House for as long as the president lives there.
I was just thinking about it. It may not rise to the level of criminality, but we may have evidence, hard evidence of a corrupt soul.
I saw you nod.
We're seeing the subtle nuances that are involved in counterintelligence work, right? And again, I know I keep hammering this, but it's not all about the crime and putting handcuffs on somebody. If a foreign entity is trying to corrupt, coerce, recruit people in our government, that is a subtle, nuanced thing, but the American people need to understand that, and we need to air it out and decide as a nation whether this is the conduct we want out of our president.
Just the last question for you on this topic. We spent more time around this table over the last 2 years talking about the counterintelligence threat. And when Andy McCabe sat at this table, and you were here that day, what he talked about was the kind of investigation that never ends in handcuffs and indictments. A counterintelligence investigation is one with a national security goal in mind, right? So if this was taken over by Mueller, do you think there's an effort underway at the Justice Department to tell the public that Andy McCabe's question was answered by Mueller and the answer is XYZ?
Yeah, I don't think we can expect the Justice Department to do that. And let's be fair, historically, counterintelligence investigations never see the light of day. I operated under almost total secrecy for 25 years. And so we need to understand that the expectations need to be different. But with regard to the metrics that Mueller used when he was handed this counterintelligence case, it's becoming clear that he used a criminal metric, and at least that's what Barr interpreted in his summary as, oh, okay, we haven't met any statutory elements of a crime. We need to see the 400 pages of counterintelligence questions and answers to figure out what really happened.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.